Under the stone arches of Jerusalem's government complex, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu convened his weekly cabinet meeting on a tense Sunday morning. Cameras clicked rapidly as the Prime Minister entered the room, surrounded by security aides and senior ministers. The mood, according to those present, was one of steely determination. The war in Gaza was entering yet another uncertain phase, and Netanyahu wanted no room for doubt about Israel's intentions. He began the session with a firm declaration of purpose. "We report to our American friends, but we do not ask for their permission. We maintain supreme security responsibility, and we will not give that up," he said, his tone measured but unyielding. Those words, carried live by national broadcasters, instantly set the tone for the rest of the meeting and for Israel's message to the world. In them lay both defiance and reassurance. Defiance toward those abroad questioning Israel's military conduct, and reassurance to citizens still reeling from months of conflict and uncertainty. Netanyahu emphasized that Israeli operations in Gaza would continue, undeterred by calls for restraint. He stated that remnants of Hamas fighters remained entrenched in southern areas, specifically in Rafah and Khan Yunis, and that Israeli forces were in the process of what he described as systematic elimination. His phrasing was deliberate. It conveyed a campaign still active, methodical, and unrelenting. Behind the language was the message that Israel's war objectives had not changed, the dismantling of Hamas's infrastructure, and the prevention of any future attacks on Israeli territory. Outside the cabinet room, the war continued to grind on. In the densely populated neighborhoods of southern Gaza, smoke once again rose from airstrikes overnight. Residents described scenes of destruction and fear as Israeli drones circled overhead. For them, Netanyahu's statements carried a grim familiarity, a sign that the ceasefire, which many hoped might bring lasting calm, remained fragile at best. Hamas accused Israel of repeated ceasefire violations, claiming that civilian areas had been targeted and aid convoys obstructed. Israeli military officials countered that all operations were defensive in nature, intended to neutralize threats to their soldiers and prevent rocket launches from within Gaza's urban sprawl. As Netanyahu spoke in Jerusalem, humanitarian agencies were issuing new warnings about deteriorating conditions inside the Strip. Aid deliveries had slowed again. Hospitals were struggling with fuel shortages, and thousands of displaced families had taken shelter in temporary camps along the southern border. International pressure was mounting on Israel to allow broader access for relief convoys, but Netanyahu made no mention of easing restrictions. Instead, he framed the campaign as a necessary defense, one rooted in sovereignty and security. The Prime Minister's remarks also touched on a controversy that has shaken Israel's domestic scene in recent days: the incident at the Steitheman detention facility, where reports surfaced of mistreatment of detainees. Netanyahu acknowledged the gravity of the matter, calling it, in his words, a severe blow to Israel's image. He urged that an independent and impartial investigation be conducted. His inclusion of the issue was notable, a nod to growing criticism from rights groups and even some within Israel's own political establishment who have questioned the government's handling of detainees in wartime conditions. In Tel Aviv, legal experts and commentators quickly seized on that statement. Was Netanyahu attempting to preempt international scrutiny or signaling a genuine commitment to accountability? The question reflected a broader tension that has defined his leadership throughout the conflict, balancing Israel's internal cohesion with its increasingly strained image abroad. Western allies, particularly in Washington and Brussels, have expressed unease over certain military tactics and the humanitarian toll of the campaign. Yet Netanyahu's message on Sunday seemed designed to reassert Israel's independence. It was a reminder that while coordination with the United States continues, ultimate decisions rest in Jerusalem, not Washington. Behind the scenes, Israeli defense officials have been briefing the cabinet on new operational data. Dozens of raids carried out across Gaza's southern sector, hundreds of tunnels discovered, and continued efforts to rescue hostages believed to remain in Hamas custody. Each update feeds into the government's narrative of progress, but also underscores the scale of the challenge. Even after months of operations, Hamas continues to demonstrate resilience through sporadic rocket launches and ambush tactics. The Israeli military has described the campaign as one of the most complex urban operations in modern warfare, with every neighborhood concealing both fighters and civilians, infrastructure and traps. In Rafah, witnesses reported tanks positioned on the city's outskirts, while leaflets dropped from aircraft warned residents to evacuate designated zones. Yet many families said there was nowhere safe to go. Humanitarian corridors, established intermittently under international mediation, have often been suspended amid renewed hostilities. For aid groups, the picture remains bleak. Tens of thousands displaced, sanitation systems collapsed, and access to clean water sharply reduced. The United Nations has reiterated its appeal for a durable ceasefire, but the latest statements from both sides suggest that political consensus remains distant. Back in Israel, the public discourse is polarized. Supporters of the Prime Minister argue that any relaxation of pressure would only embolden Hamas and endanger Israeli lives. Critics, including members of the opposition, contend that continued military escalation risks further isolation on the world stage. Yet Netanyahu's coalition, bolstered by nationalist and religious factions, appears united around a singular message: the campaign will continue until Hamas is destroyed. The Prime Minister's rhetoric also resonates with a domestic audience increasingly weary but resolute. For many Israelis, memories of the October attacks that triggered the war are still raw. The government's emphasis on security autonomy strikes a deep chord, a collective vow that Israel will defend itself, even if it means standing alone. Analysts note that Netanyahu's phrasing, "We report to our American friends, but we do not ask for their permission," is not merely symbolic. It reflects a recalibration in Israel's diplomatic posture. In practice, coordination with Washington continues daily, from intelligence sharing to military logistics. But politically, Netanyahu is crafting a narrative of independence aimed at reinforcing his image as the protector of Israel's sovereignty. In Washington, officials responded with measured statements. A spokesperson for the US State Department reiterated America's support for Israel's right to self-defense, while emphasizing the importance of minimizing civilian harm and adhering to international humanitarian law. Behind the diplomatic language, there is an unmistakable undercurrent of tension. The Biden administration has repeatedly urged Israel to exercise restraint, mindful of growing criticism from within Congress and from human rights organizations worldwide. Yet Netanyahu's government, buoyed by domestic political calculus, appears determined to maintain its course. Observers note that the dynamic between the two allies has evolved into a delicate balance: strategic cooperation on one hand and diverging political optics on the other. For Netanyahu, standing firm against perceived external pressure enhances his credibility among his right-wing base. For Washington, continued engagement is essential to preserve influence over Israeli decision-making and to manage the broader regional fallout. Meanwhile, in Gaza, each new round of airstrikes and ground raids deepens the humanitarian toll. Journalists on the ground describe hospitals overwhelmed by casualties and neighborhoods reduced to rubble. Aid workers navigate through debris to deliver supplies, often under the sound of distant artillery. The rhythm of the war, attack, pause, accusation and denial, has become grimly familiar. Ceasefire agreements, when they come, rarely last beyond a few days. Inside Israel, debates continue over the long-term goal. Should the campaign end once Hamas is dismantled, or should Israel reoccupy parts of Gaza to maintain control? The government has yet to articulate a clear post-war vision. Netanyahu's emphasis remains on the immediate task, neutralizing Hamas and restoring deterrence. But opposition figures and military veterans warn that without a defined political strategy, military success may prove temporary. Internationally, the response to Netanyahu's latest remarks has been mixed. Some Western allies quietly welcome his acknowledgement of the detention facility controversy as a sign of accountability. Others see it as a deflection, a tactical move to quell criticism, while operations continue largely unchanged. In Arab capitals, the tone is far sharper. Leaders in Amman, Doha and Cairo have condemned the ongoing strikes and accused Israel of undermining ceasefire talks. Regional diplomats warn that if the fighting resumes at full intensity, it could derail ongoing efforts to stabilize Gaza and revive peace negotiations. For Netanyahu, however, the immediate priority remains domestic stability. His government faces protests over the cost of war, the treatment of detainees, and the slow progress in securing the release of remaining hostages. Yet his political instincts, honed over decades, guide him to project resolve above all else. In Israeli politics, projecting strength often translates into survival. And so, despite growing calls for diplomacy, Netanyahu continues to speak in the language of defiance and security. As the cabinet meeting adjourned, the Prime Minister's final words echoed across the chamber, a mixture of reassurance and warning. Israel, he said, would not bow to pressure. The army would act as needed. And while cooperation with allies would continue, the defence of Israel's borders and people was a matter of national will. Those present described the atmosphere as solemn but unified, a government girding itself for another long phase of conflict. Outside, Jerusalem's afternoon light cast long shadows over the old city's walls. In Gaza, that same sun fell over broken streets and crowded shelters. Two worlds divided by a short distance, yet bound by a single conflict, moving deeper into a war that neither diplomacy nor ceasefire could yet end. And as the international community weighs its next steps, balancing humanitarian urgency with political realities, one truth remains clear: the fighting has not ceased, and neither has the rhetoric. Netanyahu's words on this Sunday morning will resonate far beyond the cabinet hall, shaping both Israel's next moves and the world's perception of its resolve. The story of Gaza, of Israel, and of this war's uncertain future continues, written day by day, statement by statement, under the unblinking gaze of a watching world.